Alrighty, now we can go ahead and get started. The time is 5:05, and we are in order. So we'll go ahead and start with roll call. Hillary, I don't know how to say last name, so my bad. Hillary Bayard, looks like is absent. Hazel Wilson. Present. And then do we want the mics and stuff, or are we good?
We should have a mic.
I was paying attention last time.
Present.
Kimberly Marquez Cortez, present. T. Lek Ying.
Present.
Marnie.
Present.
Oh, thank you. Marnie McKenzie. Marnie, okay. Absent. Christy Gardner.
Present.
R. Shane Miles. Absent. Sandra Stevens.
Present.
Kathleen Salas Tietkin. Sorry about that. Okay. Got it. Thank you. Ivana Wheeler.
Present.
Awesome. We have our roll call. Looks like we're moving into public comments. Do we have public comment?
We do. We have 3 public comments. Can I have a mic? Okay, we do. We have 3 public comments, and I will call each commenter up in order, and then you'll have 3 minutes to make your comments. And please go to the podium. First, we have Colette.
Good afternoon. My name is Colette Lae. I'm a library media tech at Federal Terrace Elementary. I understand that we are on the list for possible closure. One thing I have to say, I've been there as the library media tech since 2018. My daughters all attended school there. 2 of them have graduated from high school already. I think it would do the community in our area a huge disfavor if we were to close that school. We are the only school on this side of town. If we have students, they're going to either have to go to Cooper or Mare Island. They're going to have to cross the bridge or cross horrible busy streets. A lot of the students in our community, sometimes they're late to our school, which is right in the neighborhood. If you do make it further away for them, your attendance is going to be worse. We are, for our students, 100%. The teachers there, the staff, the students that have previously gone there, they come back, they see the teachers, they like what we do. They get love from us unconditionally. Tough love also is something that our students need sometimes. And it's something that, like I said, if you guys were to close our school, it would not benefit you guys at all. It would be horrible for you guys as a school district. So it's something that I think you guys really need to think about. We also have childcare at our school. There's 3 or 4 childcare classes that are at our school. And we were TK through 6 previously. This past year was kindergarten through 6. Next year, they're bringing back TK again. So right there is telling us that that's something that you guys need to think about. We're also having 2 additional special ed classes coming into our school this year. So that's another thing that I think you need to think about instead of closing the school. Realize that it would do a huge disfavor for the district. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Femusuai.
Hello, my name is Femusuai, and I just wanted to come up here and say about the closing on talking about closing on Federal Terrace, and I just feel like that would not be really a good idea. Big thing is transportation for the kids. Most kids have to walk to school because, you know, parents either work or they don't drive. And what Colette said too, if they close Federal Terrace in that area, then there's really no other closer schools that would be an advantage to those kids that live in that area. Yep, thank you.
Thank you. And last, we have Moana.
Hi everyone, my name is Moana. I am Colette's oldest daughter. I attended Federal Terrace Elementary School for kindergarten through 5th grade. I promoted in 2017. I then left the district because, in my opinion, the middle and high schools do tend to be where the schools go downhill. Federal Terrace was a big part of my life. It still is to this day since my mom works there. The staff and faculty and teachers truly watched me grow up and to this day support me. I received my bachelor's degree from Sonoma State University this past May. And I truly believe that the support I received from Federal Terrace and their staff, even through my middle and high school years, is what pushed me to do better. As someone who's lived in Vallejo my whole life, I've seen kids walking to school, walking to Federal Terrace, because a lot of them do live in my neighborhood. We'll go to a store or we'll be driving home and I'll hear kids yelling, "Hi, Miss Coco," and I think that really speaks volumes to how much love and support the staff at Federal Terrace show to their students. And I do think that closing the school would be a disservice to the students for transportation reasons. It would take away that comfort and stability that they've had for however long they've attended the schools. However, I do understand that you guys have a hard decision to make. I was the student board member for Griffin Academy High School my final year there. So I do understand it's not easy, but I do ask that you guys at least try to get into the heads of the students who are the main ones that will be affected by your guys' decisions that you make. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for public comment. So we're gonna move into item 4 on our agenda, which is action items. And the first thing on our action items is to approve the minutes from June 24th. So if everyone has had a chance to hopefully look those over, do we need to give a minute for folks to review? Or can we move into motion now? Okay. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll move to approve the minutes.
Thank you. Okay. Huh? Yeah, and then can I get a second? I'll second. And then we'll go ahead and vote. So Hillary is not here.
Do you want to do a roll call vote?
Hazel? So we're voting to approve the minutes. Okay. We have one abstain. Kimberly, I approve. T. Lek Ying?
Yes.
Thank you. Marne's not here. Is Christy here?
Aye.
Okay, perfect. Is Shay here? No. Sandra?
Aye.
And then Kathleen is not here. Ivana?
Aye.
Perfect. Thank you. So that motion passes. We'll go ahead and go into the next action item, which is the election to appoint of the individual or subcommittee to assist with drafting the committee report.
Yeah, so this was an action item that we had on the agenda for the first meeting, and the idea here was that some committees like to have a particular person or two people that are elected to be extra involved in the drafting of the report outside of the committee room. Usually, I kind of take the laboring oar in the drafting of the report, and then for example, there's a rough like framework that was with the materials for tonight's meeting. But then as we proceed through the next two meetings, it's possible for the committee to elect one or two other people to be a bit more involved in the drafting if that's something that you would like. Not something that we have to do, but I think the request in our first meeting was to bring this action item back for reconsideration at the second meeting. So I guess I would ask, is there anyone that has a preference that they would like to elect a committee member to be more involved outside of these meetings in the drafting of the report?
I would like to be more involved in the draft. I'd like to be that person.
Okay, okay. All right. Is there anybody else that would like to be involved in the drafting of the report? More involved?
I wouldn't mind helping as well.
Okay. Okay, so then we should take a motion to vote on T and Christie being a subcommittee of the committee to assist further with drafting of the report. So can we get a motion
So someone will
for, yeah, let's start with Christie and then we'll do T as well, separately.
move. Okay. So can I get a motion to have Christy be a part of the subcommittee?
I motion that Christie be a part of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Ivana. Can I get a second?
Second the motion.
Thank you, T. And then
Okay.
I have to do roll call to vote.
Yep.
Hazel.
Yes.
Thank you, Hazel. I vote yes. T.
Yes.
Christy.
Yes.
Sandra.
Yes.
And then Ivana.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, so we have appointed, or the committee has appointed Ms. Gardner as one of the members of the subcommittee, and then we'll take a motion on T's potential additional membership in that subcommittee.
I'll
Can we
make
get
the
a motion?
motion.
Okay.
So I make the motion to vote T. Can I get a second?
I second.
Thank you, Sandra. And then let's go ahead and vote. Hazel.
Yes.
I vote yes.
Yes. And my name is Tilak, just for the record.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Tilak.
TLAC.
Tilak. Christy.
Yes.
Sandra.
Yes.
Ivana.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, great. So we now have two elected members of the subcommittee to assist with drafting the report. So I will reach out to the subcommittee for additional comments and assistance with the report as we finalize it over the next two meetings. And then the report will always, of course, be brought back to the full committee for review and for a vote. It's just having extra assistance outside of the context of the meeting on the report.
Thank you. Okay, so then we move on to the discussion and review. Are you leading us through this one?
Yes, so there was a PowerPoint that's been prepared for this evening, and I'm going to pass it over. I think Superintendent Aurelio is going to get us started, and then we will move through the slides for the committee.
Yeah, and this will be a team effort. So we have Assistant Superintendent Tapacio, Assistant Superintendent Fernandez here as well. And we're going to go through these slides. So welcome, 7-Eleven Committee. Hazel, welcome. I know we missed you the last one. I'm glad you're in the room with us now. And for those who are absent, hopefully they will rejoin us at the next meeting because this is a quick turnaround. We have 4 meetings on the books to get this completed. So today you're going to be hearing from the group with some data. We talked a little bit about that at the last meeting, the types of data that we would be presenting to the group. As a reminder, there's 2 tasks that we're asking the 7-Eleven Committee to provide a recommendation. First and foremost, you're going to hear about some of the properties, and we are asking the 7-Eleven Committee to make a recommendation on 4 properties, whether the district can surplus those properties. The second ask of the committee is to take the 7 individual school sites that we are considering for closure and consolidation and give us a priority ranked list. This committee, this body, will not be closing any schools, but you're going to be part of the data that we do present to the school board. This coupled with the equity impact analysis report, as well as any further information and data that we collect as we go into the fall, to ultimately get to a decision with the school board by December of 2025, just to refresh folks on the timeline. So this is a really critical component of those decisions, but it's not the decision. So I just want to be clear for the public that this body is not deciding any school closures, but really just giving us information that we will use in determining those next steps. If I can get the next slide. Thank you. So to set the stage on, honestly, why we are here, this is a chart that shows enrollment going back to 2020, so right around COVID, and what has happened since that time, with the most recent enrollment in 2025 ending at about 9,600 students. Now, the red line is a projection of what if we were to continue to decline in enrollment, and we roughly decline somewhere between 300 to 500 students a year, at least that's been the trend, what would happen to our enrollment by 2033, which is drastic. I will be asking some questions throughout the evening. Really, it's mostly to get the committee to sort of think through some of the topics. So for here, simply, what are the trends you notice in our enrollment? Which that one's pretty easy to answer with this slide. And how would these trends impact our use of facilities on our campus? So last July, when I started as superintendent, we had 19 schools plus adult school, 20 campuses that we monitored. We did make a decision to close 2 of those schools, so we're down to 18 total schools now, still for a footprint of roughly 96 to maybe 9,000 students, which is still a lot of students per campus, or not a lot of students per campus. So it's something that, to consider as we go down this pathway. The other question I want you to think about as we analyze different campuses and the different connections is, given this decline, which I have hopes that that red line is not going to continue, that red line will start to flatten and then increase if we do what we're supposed to do as a school district. Given that information, how do we make sure we're not back at this table in this room in 1 or 2 years? So meaning, as we get to a closure and consolidation, this has been known as phase 2. We did phase 1 last year. I would really love to avoid a phase 3. I really want to be done after phase 2 so we can start to grow and continue to be better. So those are sort of my guiding thoughts initially on that. Next slide. This one is Sarah. She's going to tell us a little bit about the metrics.
Thank you. So one of the questions that came up at our first committee meeting was about the equity impact analysis, and we mentioned that there's a consultant that's going to be doing this analysis concurrently with the occurrence of these meetings. And I had mentioned that there were several factors, and that's how we consider equity in the context of analyzing both closure of a school and then the relocation of students from that school to either one or multiple other sites. I know there was a question from Sandra about the site, and that is here. So feel free to take a look at Ed Code section 41329. That walks us through the requirement for the EIA and the procedure that we have both for voting and preparation of the document. But I also wanted to walk through all 9 of the metrics, just so you all could see what's being analyzed. And then you could also see that a great amount of the information and the data that's being provided to the consultant for analysis, you're also going to see tonight on the slides that are being presented by staff. So we have endeavored to make sure that you have the information that you need to kind of have your part in the recommendation for the board, but also see how that is reflected in the information that's also being reviewed in the EIA. So when the board adopted these metrics, these are actually pulled from the statute, and there are 9 in total. And I'll just describe a little bit about what they are and how they've been analyzed in the past. And this is based on the equity impact analysis that was drafted for phase 1. So the first criteria is the physical condition of a school facility. And really the way that we look at this is based on the school accountability report card. There's something called the FIT tool that gives us a grade of the site. It's usually poor, good, exemplary are the common grades that are given. And the idea is to identify if not currently, but if in prior years there have been resources that were redirected away from schools that have a high number of children in poverty or disabled or of a certain race and directed to other sites. So I think most people would look at these grades and say, well, if there's a school that has a poor rating, we should close that one and move them all to a site that has an exemplary rating. But actually the guidance from the Attorney General says we should make sure that historically that site hasn't been deprived of resources for the purpose of a closure where those students are now being redirected. So that's the idea being looked at for the first criteria. The second is operating costs and potential savings. So this may be, kind of a common sense one in some ways. We're looking at, what the cost per student is. And the fact that there are like fixed costs, right, to keep a certain number of schools open. And if we can condense, students in a reasonable way into less numbers of school sites, right, that's going to help us have spend more money per student, but not be spending it on fixed costs that are just attributable to the facilities themselves. So it's really trying to maximize the savings based on how much money can be saved based on a single school closure. The third factor is the capacity of other schools to absorb students. So this one's pretty simple, looking to see that a site has the space to accommodate more enrollment from sites, whether it's an entire school moved over or one site that is split between multiple additional school sites. The fourth one is availability and transfer of special programs. So most types of programs can be moved from site to site, and they will be to accommodate when a school is closed. But this factor looks at, are there any truly unique programs that can only be operated at a single school site, and will that program essentially be lost to the district if that site is closed? The fifth factor is environmental factors. Again, this one is pretty self-explanatory, but looking at things like the locations of highways and railroads and industries within the city, and then trying to identify whether a closure is going to impact moving students, more students closer to one of those hazards, or having them have to like transport, for example, over a major highway or around a major road or a railroad or near industry. And then the sixth factor is balance of pupil demographics, right? So looking at numbers of foster students, homeless students, disabled, and then the race makeup of students at a school, and ensuring that by moving students to a certain site, we're not causing segregation or worsening, or really that we're really not just having a disproportionate impact on students of a certain classification. The seventh factor is transportation, and this one is really looked at based on there's kind of this presumed like distance under which a student is or a family is kind of expected to get kids to school. So for K through 5, it's 1.5 miles, and for 6 to 8, it's 2.25 miles. And then for high school students, there is no particular like measure in the administrative regulation, but essentially we're just looking at, does closure of one school and relocation to another school make it so that more kids than are outside of those boundaries for transportation purposes and then need to be transported. The eighth factor is aesthetics and opportunity for blight. So this is really, the fact that when a school's closed and it's no longer being used by the community each day, there's options or there's opportunity, right, for vandalism, for misuse of the site, for liability. And so it's really looking at what are the alternative uses, or are there other options that we can identify for the site that will make it not a bad thing to have it closed, right? Are there other ways that we can reuse the site to make it a benefit for the community? And then the ninth factor is input on feeder schools. And this is looking at things like attendance patterns, and again, just ensuring not only how race and disability and students with special circumstances at the closed site are impacted, but also those at the receptor site, right? So does closing and like relocating students to one of those sites maintain some form of segregation or increase that issue to the extent that it currently exists at that site? So that's just kind of a brief summary again of those 9 factors, and all of those are being looked at in great detail by the consultant that is drafting the EIA currently, and they're looking at all those iterations of the closure and the relocation. And we won't be bringing the EIA in its entirety for committee review, but again, I'm hoping you can see tonight as we walk through the rest of the data that a lot of these factors are being addressed in the information that we're bringing to you as the 7-Eleven committee. Any questions on those factors before we move forward? Okay, great. Then I will hand the mic over.
Good evening. So the next slide will go through some of the unrestricted expenditures that we have identified that could impact, and from a positive perspective, on the school district's budget. What we've done is we've broken them down by school site into some major categories. The top category there, administration, is related to the cost of administrative staff, so our site principals. If there's a vice principal there, that also category also includes that cost, as well as the statutory costs, which are health benefits and retirement contributions. Classified staff, which are the folks that are supporting our classrooms, our instructional aides, our custodians, our other facilities employees, those are the costs associated with those. That second column there, instructional media and library, those are our folks who support our kids in the library and with our technology or educational technology, not from an IT perspective, but from an educational perspective. Instruction and teaching, those are our teachers that are on staff, also our teacher leaders as well. Site security is another major category. Those are our site safety folks that are ensuring that our students are safe on campus, as well as mixed in there, if we do have some external companies that we are using to secure our facilities after hours, some of our community schools are in need of that coverage overnight so that we're protecting our facilities. And then utilities is the last one there, gas, water, and electricity. We're expecting, moderate savings from that. We still have to run the water. We still have to run the power for lighting. For the most part, we'll see some pretty significant savings there. Administration, I'll go back to the top. Administration, we would likely to see all of those dollars saved. Classified staff, we'd see a small portion of that because a lot of those folks may be assigned to other sites throughout this process. Our instructional aides will follow the students as they go. The custodial side, we may see some savings, and on the site safety side, we might see some savings. Instruction and teaching, those folks, those professionals will follow their students as they go to another school. Just to be clear, the grand total, the estimated ongoing savings, these are ongoing. These will be compounded over time as we move through the years, as we may potentially make these reductions. This does not include restricted funds that support, professional development at our sites for our teachers, funds on the federal side, the title side that support some of the programs that may support our students of the greatest need. We are expecting, again, as I said, the savings on the administration side and some on the staffing side. This does not include the maintenance facilities expenditures. Depending on how we use the facility is used, we still need to repair the roof, right? We can't let these facilities go into disrepair and then have to bring them back from some catastrophic issues that may happen over time. As I'll share in a later slide, the bond dollars that we may have spent at those sites, we would invest those in other programs at other schools. So a couple of questions, as Superintendent had mentioned, as you may want to think about is, are there any cost patterns that may stand out to you? Things that you see here that may drive some questions or some thoughts? And which sites, if closed, might free up the most funds for reinvestment into our student-facing programs? I'll stop there for a moment if there are any questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is there a reason why 3 of the sites have the site safety and the others do not?
Some of those sites do not have site safety staff on campus. There are different needs at every site. I would, however, mention that even though it is blank now, if we did close that school, we would have to incur some after-hours kind of roving security services there. When we do, in the past when that's happened, we've had to invest in those services to protect them from theft and other activities.
I have one more question.
Sure.
And if you were to close any of the sites that have the site safety, would those go over to the other sites, or they would no longer exist?
They would likely be reevaluated to see if they're still in need at the other sites.
Just so I'm 100% clear, this is the anticipated annual savings. This if that site is closed,
Correct.
these are the anticipated savings.
Correct.
That the
Estimated
district-
savings. Yeah.
right.
So one thing I think that's important with this slide is that closing an individual school is not going to balance our budget, right? Because if you look at the bottom line and those savings, that's not the only force driving this work. Part of what we're looking at is, as we do consolidate or close schools, how do we provide programs or schools that are attractive to our community? So not just subtract, but how do we add as well?
Quick question.
Sure.
How are the savings calculated?
So we're taking, so administration, I'll take you through each one. Administration, we're expecting most of those dollars to come back. Classified staff, anywhere between 20 and 40%, depending on kind of where those programs follow. Instructional media, library, a small percentage of that, about 20% of that, we're expecting in savings. Instruction and teaching, it's going to be less than 10% because most of those staff will follow. Perhaps we won't have the same amount of teacher leaders at the site, so those may be reduced. So we had to have some dollars built in there. Site security, again, as I said, we may have to add security there for closing. But for the most part, those savings will come back to us. And gas, water, electricity, we have some data on some of the school sites we've closed, and anywhere between 30 to 50% savings there, depending on what program remains there.
So generally, it's an informed application of a percentage.
Correct.
Well, and just to add, right, it's mostly your non-instructional staff that would come in the form of savings. Because those instructional staff most likely will travel with students.
Yeah, is there any way we could get like this in Excel or something? Because I'm curious on like say for this, if we're using this data, like how does that break down versus the student populations that we have, like the numbers, like how much is it per student? And I think it's there, but hard to compare.
T-Leak and I are like in sync on that because I mentioned that earlier.
Yeah. Yes, we could put that together. Moving on to the next slide, Heather and I will put this one together. This is a snapshot of our enrollment and capacity. This is based off of 25-26 projected enrollment data. We have our schools on the left. We have the grade spans that they serve to that column just over. And then we also have at the next column over is our projected enrollment for 25-26. Our available capacity in green, the percentage capacity based off of the max site capacity at 28-1. I'll let Heather kind of take us through the next few columns.
Right, the next couple columns are important because not every classroom space is used at a ratio of 28-1 or 32-1. Some classroom spaces, the ratio is much smaller. So we're calling out the number of special education classrooms, which are often either 9-1 or 12-1, you know, so much fewer students in those classrooms. And of course, we have dedicated preschool classroom spaces in some of our campuses. Those programs serve our community in a different way and, you know, have their own funding source these preschool programs have their own funding source to maintain them. So it's important that when we're making considerations about the capacity of our buildings, that we are considering that those services will also need to continue. And we want to make sure that however we configure our combinations of campuses, if we do that, that we consider the needs of those programs. Also, in the very last column, we included that data just so you have a real-life comparison of how many students used to be on these campuses 10 or so years ago, right? I picked that year because it was the year I was first a principal, so I know what that year looks like, right? And I know what campuses look like with that many students on them. So you can see that Cooper at one time had 579 students, so it could at least hold that, right? We know for sure because in the very recent, we're not talking about 30 years ago when things look different. In the very recent past, that's what it held. Federal Terrace at one time at 13, 14, 393 students. Highland had 657, Lincoln 212, Pennycook 584, and Stephen Manor 683 in their current buildings with similar programs, right? So I think it's important that we just be able to visualize what could be reasonably accommodated on a campus. What we know is that we talk about max site capacity. We know that, we don't want to stretch it all the way to the max because we still have, again, these classrooms that are needed for specialized programs.
And I'll just wrap this these columns up with the physical site condition. So that data is based off of our SARC reports, which also include a facility analysis, our fit inspections. So just to give you an idea of what good means. So there's three categories. There's good, fair, and poor. Good is no significant deficiencies. Fair is there's some non-critical issues, and poor, which means the site is unsafe or major repair needed. For the most part, our internal maintenance staff has done a good job, and we've also invested in some of the systems, the HVAC systems, the roofs across our school districts. So those sites are in pretty good condition. And some of the categories that are looked at, again, I mentioned systems, HVAC, ventilation, gas, water, sewer, plumbing, fire sprinklers. On the interior side, that report looks at the floors, walls, ceilings, paint, classroom spaces. Cleanliness is also looked at as well, electrical, restrooms, emergency exits, security hardware, structural conditions such as the roof, stairs and ramps, and on the external side, looking at playground safety, landscaping, and irrigation. So all of those things go into those ratings, and so for the most part, our sites are in pretty good shape.
Can I ask a question? Looking at the column where it's percent capacity, part of what's driven some of this work is our percentage of capacity. Is there a recommendation from the state on where they would like school districts to be at in capacity? Is there a best practice for what would be like a target for capacity?
I think every school district is very different. I think if you look at any school site, there's portables on every site. So how does that capacity weigh in with some of the portable buildings that we've had to put in during times of growth in California? So I'm not aware of a percentage capacity that is recommended. I think you want the flexibility to have some space. So you obviously don't want to be bursting at the seams, but You do want to have some flexibility, so if one classroom does go down or you have an electrical issue, in my experience, facility manager, being able to move students to those alternative spaces can be very, very helpful, so.
Yeah, I guess a couple questions. Actually, I had almost exactly the same question, which was like regionally, what is average for said capacity? Very similar, but a couple other questions. One is to your point about special education classrooms and what their capacity is there. What is what is their capacity like? So it says special education classrooms for each of the three. What's their capacity or utilization?
So ratios in a special education classroom are capped both contractually and in best practices, right? So if is a classroom of students with autism, for instance, you may not want to exceed 9, whereas other mild to moderate disabilities, it may be 12, right? So it depends on the classroom and the needs of the students in that classroom. But as you can see, that's much different than a class of 32 children in a general education 5th grade classroom, right?
No, I meant more like if its capacity is 4 classrooms, or does
Oh,
that just mean how
just
many
means
classrooms there are
Oh,
right
yes,
now?
apologies,
Oh,
yes,
okay.
that's what that means. That means that on that campus today,
There are 4
there are
classrooms.
4 classrooms dedicated to that use.
I see.
And that those programs must continue. And so whatever plan we develop has to have those classrooms in consideration. Okay?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. No.
We can come back to this if it's more questions.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Actually, this is sort of like the demographics and enrollment section, I guess, because that question, I actually had a question really about that first table and the student enrollment that's
Going all the way back to the
line going
beginning, yes.
And I guess 2 kind of questions. One is that, I mean, I feel like you can just draw a line down, but is that realistic? Is that really what they've projected? And then 2, and you could take is that's really fast drop in enrollment in just 5 years, and that doesn't seem like demographic driven. That seems like something else is going on.
Well, part of it's that trend, right? So we've been losing on average between 300 to 500 students a year.
And that's just demographics?
That's
like-
that's the count. So we lose students for a variety of reasons. We lose some students to local charters, right? So we compete with our local charter schools. We also lose students to neighboring school districts via transfer. So we have a number of families that request to be schooled in American Canyon, which is part of Napa Valley Unified, completely different school district, actually a different county as well. And Benicia Unified are the 2 districts that we tend to lose students to, proximity-wise. So we're working on curbing that as well and making sure it's not what is it you're saying? It's not a right, it's a request. So transfers are no longer a right, they are a request. And we are ensuring that we're applying ed code and policy to try to keep our students. So my hope is that line is going to flatten, and it's not going to be that red line.
I was just going to add, this is not necessarily unique to this district. I've worked with districts all over the state in their closures and consolidations and declining enrollment, and this trend and a chart that looks very much like this is very, very common all over the state.
Are we also addressing the things that are attracting them to Benicia and to American Canyon? Because many times those reasons may not be true reasons and are false and rumors, and people will jump on the bandwagon to use them if the district is not addressing the issues and also ensuring that we follow the law in allowing transfers and not just signing off on the transfers. And because my friend goes to American Canyon, then I want my child to go there. My friend's child goes there, so I want my child to go there. And then frequently using the excuse of safety. But if we look at our numbers for safety, I'm sure there's improvement, and no different from other districts neighboring. As the education chair for the NAACP, there were those who looked at one nearby district who felt it was the district to go to until an incident happened that woke them up. And then they come running to us to take care of it. So I think it's very important that as a district that we present our best. And there are many good things in this district, and we have to sell it. Thank you.
You're not going to get any argument from me.
Just to speak to a couple of things you said, I think Superintendent mentioned the revised procedures and process and policy related to transfers that has just been approved by our governing board, and how we will approach transfers in a very different light, where it is not a automatic approval. And so we are working with the county as well for them to understand our new procedures and processes so that we have better support and acknowledgement of our procedures in allowing us to be in local control around that issue. You mentioned selling ourselves. That is a big undertaking, as Director Baggyhow can attest. And I hope you're seeing that, that flood of positivity in our community. But also on those one-to-one relationships that we have with our parents to make sure they know that our neighborhood schools, especially as they transition out of elementary school, have amazing programs, and their child will be safe in those programs. And lastly, looking at all of our other opportunities to, improve offerings in sports here locally so that kids can do their sports, either middle school sports here, as opposed to needing to transition out to have those opportunities. So all of those programmatic improvements are well underway on that attract and retain, vein. And so there's a lot of effort in that regard.
And we're going to keep telling people to think VCUSD first. That's our tagline now. Think VCUSD first, because a lot of families submit transfer requests having never tried any of our schools.
In middle school sports, it really needs to start in elementary, because they sign up for, example, American Canyon, and then they make friends with those kids, and that's when the transferring out goes. It's very important to have programs from elementary, and I'm just shocked at where we are now with the Little Leagues. They're virtually non-existent. This is the city where the Hall of Famer, C.C. Sabathia, will be inducted on Monday, July 27th. Vallejo High graduate, North Vallejo Little League. And we do not have Little League. That's amazing. When my son came through, of course now he's coaching at Vallejo High, but Vallejo Little League, North Vallejo Little League, Wilson Park, it's unbelievable how it has all gone down the tube in the community. That's where it starts. Those relationships that are founded on those teams. And then those kids want to go to schools together. Now, I do have one question. Have we looked at, the fact that we have 2 high schools and 1 middle school? We receive, in AACP, we receive complaints about 1 middle school. All the kids at 1 middle school. So that's something to look at also.
Thank you for that. One comprehensive middle school. We do have some K-8s though, so I know, but one comprehensive middle school. Yeah, and that was a process of previous closures that we ended up there. Yeah.
When they, when we have the discussion about one comprehensive middle school, what is said is that they want a real middle school experience for their child, but they don't want it in that one environment.
And on the sports side, I highlighted middle school, but in expanded learning, all the way down to the early grades of expanded learning, they're doing team sports.
Okay.
And this year, they started with basketball and soccer, and they'll expand next year.
And if I could add too about the little leagues, and part of that is also the city and the community in developing that. Many of those programs aren't typically run by school districts; they're run by the city or the rec departments within the cities. That's
Yes,
something
I served on the
Yeah.
board of Vallejo Littles League and Babe Ruth. And I support all the high school teams. So, no, I understand it well, but it's something to think about. Thank you.
I had a question. You all mentioned earlier that when you were talking about the very first, we don't have to go to that slide, but the very first graph that shows the decline and projected decline, you mentioned the adult school also, but that's not shown on the slide that we're on right now. Do any of these schools that we're looking at have adult school, like that they're?
No, so the adult school is a standalone program. So their enrollment count is not captured in this.
Got it.
This is just our sort of TK 12 students.
Okay.
But forecasting for future slides, when we talk about what could go in campuses, adult school does play into some of that as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, this is probably the more simpler of slides that you'll see. But we did want to capture the expenditures that we've made at our sites to improve our facilities through the bond, through the Measure S bond. As you can see, we've invested considerably in most of our sites, and what we've invested in is our systems. I mentioned earlier, the FIT analysis looks at our systems, so HVAC, plumbing, roofing, things that keep kids dry, cool, warm, comfortable in their classrooms. We do have active project going on at Steffen Manor, which is related to those systems. HVAC systems is one of the major things we're doing there, and so on and so forth. All the other investments have been right in line with those systems. So again, keeping our students safe and comfortable in their seats. And so right now we've pulled back on those investments, obviously, for these sites as we evaluate with your recommendations, and the board will look at recommendations in the future for what could we do with the remaining bond dollars that we do have. And again, to your point, how do we reinvest those dollars into the programs that we continue to move on, and how do we redefine, how we're serving our community? So, any questions there?
For the bonds, is that over what period of time? Like since what year?
So probably about, there are 2 series, so around about 20 years of investments over that time. The current bond, which is what the dollars we're looking at now, is about a 10-year period. So, okay, we talked a lot about pupil transportation and the impact of that. We heard from our community about that. And so I'm going to walk you through this slide. This was provided by the organization, the firm that is doing our equity impact analysis. We wanted to bring you some information on what that might look like, the impact of that. And so this is a draft of estimated students that may require additional transportation services. So if we were to close a school, what is the impact on our kids? So this data is based off of our demographic data for where our students live. We've got a way to chart that through a demographer's report, as well as taking a look at the routes that we have and the service that we do provide. So something we're really trying to think about and be thoughtful about. So at the top is the least impactful. If we did close the school, you can see on the right those arrows. If you go down, it's more impactful if we do close those schools. If you go to the left of those arrows that go up and down, you'll see estimate. That's the estimated students that would be impacted by a closure. As it goes down, it gets higher. And then, of course, as we move down, you'll see the distances increase as well. Now, these are based off of as the crow flies. The more detailed analysis will come out in the equity impact report, but we did want to get you some information on what that would look like. There's some more information about board policy and what we're required to do. We're not required to provide transportation services through board policy through high school students. However, there are minimum distances for our TK5, excuse me, and our 6 to 8 schools, 6 to 8 students. And so, again, as you go down, the more impact to those students. Yeah. So, happy to answer any questions on this slide.
Well, I'm just curious in what you all see in this slide.
I think just kind of reiterating what was brought up in the public comment, that Federal Terrace would be heavily impacted by transportation.
Right, I was going to mention, we did hear a public comment where they talked about a bridge and a busy street. And this chart kind of demonstrates that.
So I hear and I see in the notes on the bottom that says that we don't need to provide transportation for the high schools. Is there costs that are estimated if we were to do any of the lower options or like the higher impacted, what the cost would be to provide transportations for the students?
That's a good question. We haven't done that analysis yet.
One thing to note with high schools, we're not necessarily talking theoretically it's on the list as if we closed Finney, but realistically what we've been really discussing is what if we moved Finney to a different campus, right? The dominoes that could happen if you close a campus and you move Finney. Moving Finney as a program, as a complete program, wouldn't generate a need for additional transportation. So students who are already transported to Finney would continue to get transported to Finney regardless of where it's placed.
I had a question just about, so like number 9 is Cooper to Highland.
Yes,
No, wait.
you're right, Cooper to Highland.
Oh, no, never mind.
So one thing with Cooper and Highland both, if you remember when we talked a little bit about the different options, just for structure, we're saying Cooper to Highland, Highland to Cooper, but realistically, if one of those schools closes, let's say we close Highland or we close Cooper, we would be looking at the process of redrawing boundaries. So if you're north of Highland, you would go in a certain direction. If you're west of Highland, you would go in a certain direction. So it's not a true one-for-one, close this school, they're going to this school. It would really depend geographically on where those families are located.
It's kind of hard because you have like the number of estimates, that's a number of students of impacted,
Correct.
right? But depending on which direction it is,
It changes.
It could be different.
It could be.
And it's, yeah, that's pretty hard.
And so this is why it's got to be an estimate, because you're not going to necessarily take every kid and move them, the superintendent was saying. It would be, they might go to one of 3 places.
And in the process, families always have some choice in the matter. So even As an example, with Loma and Mare Island, families were able to choose. So for Mare Island families, they had an option to stay on the newly formed Vallejo Charter School, but they also had an option to transfer to a different school. A transfer didn't dictate that we were going to provide transportation. So there's nuance in that.
And these numbers include like the special programs and stuff too?
So students in those specialized programs may have transportation as part of their IEP. So this would not be, this wouldn't be relevant for that conversation. Those students would continue to be provided with transportation because it's written into their individualized plan. So this is really, like I said, it's really just an estimate to give you a snapshot of the impact. But to get granular like that, we'd have to go kid by kid.
And just so that the committee knows, the governing board did give direction that as we go through this analysis, they really wanted transportation to be on the forefront. They wanted to make sure if we did close a school site, transportation's not a reason a student misses school.
Do we have just like broad statistics for how the kids get to school for each of these sites? Like what percentage are, regardless of how far they are, like walking, biking, it's obviously a different impact even if it's close, but they're being, 80% are being driven and dropped off every day, and then they have to drive a half a mile more versus it's truly a neighborhood and they're all walking to school or biking to school.
I don't know if we have that data.
We don't.
We've done some surveying in the past around, like when we were working with the county on safe routes to school, like how children do arrive at school, but we haven't done it for a few years, like post-COVID. We have our guesses, but they would just be guesses right now.
I think what we can realistically do is something that we did in phase 1, which is a plot map of where families live relative to the school. And then you're just making assumptions, right? Someone could live a block away and still drive.
And then I think for this, I speak because I have a daughter in special program, and we're not even near the school that we have to go to for her, and then my other kid goes to a completely different school. I feel like the special education programs will be heavily impacted because there's only so many schools that offer them too.
So the special education programs aren't tied to a campus because we can't serve every special education need on every campus. So that's part of why busing is more often provided for students with an IEP, because you more than likely are not attending your home school. And then parents have the opportunity to request, an internal district transfer to maybe keep their kids together if they'd like. Yeah, so this won't impact like a special education program in closing, but it might precipitate some movement. Oh, I'm sorry.
You just gotta interrupt. Just interrupt.
Snatch this back whenever you're ready.
Okay, so we did want to present, right, so there's this whole conversation that's kind of an undertone to the discussion about a site being closed and then reused. And we wanted to kind of bring out some ideas of what else can be done with sites after they're closed. Or after, a program is moved from one site to another. And there's kind of two ways that I think about this. There are alternative internal district and community uses, right? So like repurposing of facilities for other district uses or for community uses more broadly. And then there's other options about sale, lease, or other disposition. So bringing in outside users, right, to either help generate revenue through that use, or to just, help make alternative use of a site that is sitting empty, right? So there's various other ways to use a site that's been closed. On the left-hand side, you'll see the list about certain, ideas for alternative district or community uses, more room for specialized education programs, expanded learning programs, or other community services. And some of these that we talked about in the last phase, for example, were after-school programs or health centers, or like a separately designated spot for professional development. And then separately, there's outside uses, so sale, lease, and other forms of disposition. And we haven't talked a whole lot about the surplus designation component, right? There's kind of the two questions for the committee. The first one being that like ordered list of preference of closures if they had to happen, and then also of the 4 sites that have been listed, are they should they be called a surplus in the report? And so this slide kind of informs both, but one of the things that I wanted to highlight is for a district to enter into a long-term lease of a site or potentially sell a site, that's the need for the surplus designation, right? So if one of the options that you're thinking is, yes, we could consolidate 2 elementary schools and then leave that open site available for a long-term lease, there's some procedure that goes along with the district being able to open that site up for that option. And that gives the district both the ability to retain ownership of that school should, circumstances change or we need to move programs, but then also generate revenue through a long-term lease. So I mentioned that to kind of keep this in your mind with regard to not just the first ask of the committee, but also the second about whether or not those 4 sites should be surplus. On the right-hand side, we kind of break down some of the alternative options. So sale of a site is an option if it's the right size, if we haven't had recent bond expenditures on the site, and then if it's of a nature that would be of appeal on the market. The shape next to it says waiver, and I mention that because normally if there is a site that the committee is asking to declare a surplus, there's a process by which if that site is going to be sold, we can seek a waiver from the State Board of Education to give the board more freedom with regard to how that site gets sold. So not having to sell it for the highest price, but looking at other factors that could benefit the community, for example. So usually if there is at least one site in the report that we designate as surplus, I'll also ask the committee to opine about whether or not they want to give the board or they want to recommend the board the option of going through the waivers process. And as we start to draft the report in more detail, I can give you more detail about the waivers process as well. Lease is our third option here, and again, these could be something like a short-term lease for 30 days. It could also be, 5, 10, or 20-year leases of district sites where, again, we could make use of it alternatively for some time in the short term even, and then still have that site be available for alternative district uses if circumstances change in the future. Employee housing is also listed here. This is a really current topic for school districts right now because there's so much legislation and even some money that's been made available for districts to either self-fund building of employee housing or work with developers to build employee housing on district property. And there's certain ways that that can be designated to help to benefit not only the community but district employees specifically. And then on the bottom, use and license agreement. So this is very similar to a lease, but they don't actually have a property right? So these are usually more of a short-term agreement, but again, it just allows an alternative use of district property for a short period of time, sometimes to help generate revenue, but always to kind of keep the site active, right? So it's not just sitting vacant. And then an exchange is one of the other options in the education code that says that if there's an alternative piece of property that can be identified that the district can make better use of, there's this kind of one-for-one swap option where instead of a straight sale of property, there can be an exchange of sites. So to kind of summarize, the idea is just to kind of get your wheels turning about what are some of the alternative uses of sites, what can happen with the site that's been closed, and all of the ways that can benefit the district both short term and long term. Any questions there?
Yes, I have one. or a concern. If, let's say, a new charter school, that would be a great concern, because we don't want to lose any more students. Came in and wanted one of our sites that we designate as whatever and are not using it. What are those possibilities?
Yeah, so a charter school can't designate a particular site. They can explain that they have a need, and then the school district has an obligation to fill that need, but not with any particular school site. So just having open school sites by itself doesn't necessarily mean that a charter has a right to one of those sites. There are a number of charters currently operating within the district, and most, if not all, of those charters have a current agreement for use of district facilities for the foreseeable future. So we don't foresee there being much movement with regard to those that currently operate within the district. And even if there were to be a new charter approved in the next, how many years, it's not that they have an entitlement to a particular site just because it's empty or open.
But it is a concern that we're monitoring and making sure. Partly why we want to make sure we get the right size for our district, including our facilities spaces. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we're about to dive into each one of these school sites and these options that we've talked about, the sort of scenarios as we play them out. But I want to sort of push on the committee to think, if you go back to the beginning, the first slide, where I spoke to sort of not wanting to get to a phase 3. So I'm going to push. Now, you're not deciding on school closures, but you're going to strategically rank these. And I'm not going to tell you what I want. So I'm going to have you determine what those things are. But I get asked a lot as the superintendent, well, how many more schools do you need to close? Give us a number. What are you trying to do? So I'm going to give you a number. And this is going to, now on cameras. So if you had to recommend the closure of 3 schools, which combination would best support stability, equity, and student opportunity? So hold that question as we go through these. Which site closures, when paired, could actually strengthen academic programs or open new possibilities for innovation? That's sort of the lens I want you to think through as you analyze these schools.
Can I ask a question? Where are you getting that number? Like, the
Why
question of
3?
3? Yeah, why 3?
For me, I look, and if you go to the next slide, I think about where we strategically have campuses now, geographically located. All those many different factors, those 9 factors that create the equity impact analysis. Do we have space at one campus versus another? If we were to combine campuses, could we strengthen those programs? I have a path in my head that I don't want to share yet, because I want you to have an unbiased approach to what you're looking at. It could be 4, it could be 5, or it could be 1. Part of that is also data to be determined. So you heard from Heather Topacio that we've made some changes, for example, with the transfer process. Is that going to generate more students in the fall? Maybe we don't have to go as deep. So I'm starting with 3, but it doesn't mean it will remain 3. It could go up or down. But when pushed, and right now, if you ask me, I'm saying 3. But there's still more data that we'll need.
Thank you.
So just as a reminder, geographically, you see where the school sites are located. They're highlighted for you. As we move to the next slide, these were sort of big picture scenario. We will talk about Lincoln Elementary, sort of as standalone, what we do with that school, Federal Terrace as a standalone. I have Highland and Cooper separately, because like I mentioned before, if we were to close one of those schools, we would redistribute students sort of based geographically. Penny, Cook, and Stephan, the arrow goes in two directions because those are two schools that we would consider consolidating. Most likely, if we closed one of those schools, the other school would travel to the neighboring school. And then Finney, realistically, Finney as a campus has 5 individual programs. There are lots of different options there. We would most likely want to keep them together as a whole. And if a campus was available other than the current Finney campus, the reason we would move that is to get access, going back to the bond dollars in campuses. You remember seeing only $64,000 in bond expenditures. So that campus does give us options as far as lease or sale in the future that could generate revenue. So that's why Finney is realistically on this list, not because we want to close Finney, but it does give us, it's one of those dominoes that could be moved that gives us access to a facility that could generate revenue. I don't remember if we decided who's walking us through these slides.
So this is some information about what do we do if we were to close Lincoln. We would, again, we draw boundaries in the surrounding schools depending upon those student addresses, but knowing that a good chunk of students in the Lincoln neighborhood live at 2 large apartment complexes, so they would all most of them would go to the closest nearby school, which is probably more than likely Highland. And, you know, what would the benefit be? Lincoln has been a very small school for a long time with 1 teacher at each grade level, right? We reduced the size of Lincoln a couple of years ago to only serve the early primary grades because for a few reasons. One, it was difficult to staff that school. There were some, service needs that were difficult to meet with the number of grades we had. We are increasing it back to 3rd grade for this coming year since everything has stabilized at Lincoln over the last year or 2. But what closure of Lincoln does is allow us to have students be at a school where maybe their teachers could have more opportunity for true collaboration, have fewer years in consecutive years where maybe they don't have a teacher of record at the start of the year. So those are some problems that we can affect. We also have an opportunity where we have more students to just really focus our dollars and maybe make the combined campus more attractive. You'll see that program benefit come up on all of the elementary closures. You see the fiscal benefit. The drawbacks are real. We have a high rate of absenteeism for students at Lincoln, and there will likely be some transportation costs because of the needs of that community. That is our lowest income community, so we want to be really thoughtful about how we serve their needs. And also making sure that wherever we combine students, we're providing for expanded learning services. That is our after-school program. That's the name of after-school programs, expanded learning. And so making sure that all of the students, and nearly 100% of Lincoln students participate in expanded learning, so making sure that those students don't miss out on that opportunity. As I said, this is our lowest income neighborhood, so we want to be really thoughtful about what we do to serve this neighborhood. Let's see. What we might do at that campus, should it close, is provide some additional community services so that we don't have a vacant property that might attract blight in that neighborhood. We could offer spring and summer programming through expanded learning that might include tutoring, enrichment, mental health services for students when the school, outside of this regular school year. We have a burgeoning full-service community school resource program, so we could, ensure that we're partnering with city services and other community-based programs, make sure that there are local clinic services. Even though we have a VCUSD clinic that serves our neighborhoods, it may be out of reach due to transportation to the families of that neighborhood. We might provide a satellite ESL class through our adult school. There's things that we can do and bring services closer to the neighborhood. And one of the things that we might consider is opening a preschool or infant toddler childcare program in that neighborhood, which we have in other places in our district, but maybe we can provide it in a neighborhood that has a higher need.
Any questions on Lincoln?
I had a question. Is there a reason why if that school was closed, it would only is there a reason why those 3 schools are being pulled instead of Finney as an option? Because it looks like Finney's pretty close to it too.
So Finney, so this is an elementary school, so we would make sure that those students flow to another elementary school.
Got it. Okay.
Finney serves continuation high school students and independent study program and our special education, a program for special education for high school students. So it wouldn't be an appropriate campus.
Got it.
Any other Lincoln-based questions?
Federal Terrace. Again, we would have to redraw the boundaries for students to go to neighboring schools. Similar programmatic benefits. These are options that we would review for any of the potential closures for elementary. You see the ongoing fiscal benefit, and that's taken from the previous slides. Again, as it's been mentioned, transportation costs will be a significant issue. This is a campus that hosts both special education and preschool programs, so we would need to accommodate that. And making sure that, again, students who utilize the expanded learning program can continue to participate. If this campus were vacated, we would be able to move the entire Finney complex to that campus if we wanted to. That would become an option.
Any questions on Federal Terrace? Yeah.
That's the one, yeah, that, as far as actual, like, student enrollment, it's very small.
We can go back. We can go back.
The enrollment one.
Slide 5. Yep.
Federal Terrace is
Yep.
currently enrolled, projected for next year at 221
Yeah,
students
that's the one where it's like almost half
of the enrollment.
the 2013. I'll use those numbers sort of for what we might expect or something like that, or maybe what the hope would be rather than just the full max site capacity, right? So that's almost half.
Right.
I mean, I guess all of them are kind of down by quite a
And,
lot, but that one's quite a lot.
and thus the impetus for knowing that we need to consolidate, campuses.
Yeah. Is there anything about the regional demographics or anything like that made that
Will you go to the map?
more so than any other campus?
I-
Because that is off by its own. I get the point of the public comments that we had earlier that geographically it's a bit more remote and serves a population that would be hard to
And
travel to the other campuses.
so
but it also has
historically-
like a fairly precipitous decline in enrollment.
So historically, that neighborhood served Mare Island when it was a shipyard. There was Navy housing near that location. That hasn't been for, 25, 30 years, something like that, but.
That's what I was
Do you want to come to the mic, Principal Carbonell?
Hi, I'm Marissa Carbonell. I've been principal at Federal Terrace for, 18 years. So a couple of things happened to us on that side of town. Number one, Mare Island reopened, right? So when I came to Federal Terrace in 2005, 2006, Mare Island was closed.
The elementary school.
the elementary school. So Mare Island, a couple of years into my tenure there, Mare Island was reopened and we lost students. Then a charter school opened and then we lost students again. But then also there's a park and then there's a lot of housing around the park. That all was Title VIII section housing. And that designation was lost. And that was the biggest impact in my 18 years at Federal Terrace, was when the housing developments around our school lost the Section 8, the population moved from families to just individual people with 2-3 cars. You you come to Federal Terrace and you'll see Mercedes-Benzes and you'll see beautiful homes now that are really just single people or a couple or just kids. Just that Section 8, when we lost that, we lost half of our population, really.
Thank you.
So as we say, it's never one thing, right?
It's not changing demographics, changing housing.
Okay. And then consolidation of Pennycook and Stephan. Similar programmatic benefits. Again, the fiscal benefit, only slightly different between the two. There are some key programs at Pennycook and Stephan Manor that we want to make sure we retain. We are the regional provider for deaf and hard of hearing services for the county. So we want to make sure that that is maintained, especially since it's a source of revenue for our district as well. But that is housed at Pennycook. Stephan Manor also has special education programs, and Stephan Manor has preschool programs. So it's important that we maintain those programs, and we want to make sure that our expanded learning services can be robust enough and maintain the ratios necessary to serve as many students as possible. These are, key programs in our neighborhoods that I know that our families rely on for care after school and enrichment and activities. And whichever facility is vacated, that would be an option for the Finney complex.
Any Pennycook or Stephan Manor questions from the group? If you go back to the map, physically, you could, no, question? Great.
Yeah, I mean, like physically they are super close, so it's easy to conceptualize. But the numbers wise, it wouldn't just be a 1-to-1, like they just all go over because it wouldn't fit, or would it fit?
They would. That would be, I did the math because I anticipated that question. They would, that would, based on the projection, it would bring 737 students to the combined school, which if we go back to that chart is just under so it's under the max capacity estimate
sites, yeah.
of both sites. So they would fit. And some families at Pennycook may say, oh, can I go up the hill to Glen Cove instead? Because I'm actually a little closer to there. That's my family's neighborhood, so I could see some families choosing to go up the hill to Glen Cove or over to Wardlaw, or, people might make slightly different choices that might offset that number a little bit.
So it seems that the distinguishing factor between Pennycook and Stephan comes down to the condition of the campus. One is fair and the other is good. The savings are identical. The enrollment is really close. The transportation doesn't appear to be an issue.
Well, there's a reason these schools got on the list.
Pardon me?
There's a reason these schools end up on this list, is we have to look at all those factors. And Pennycook and Stephan were looked at, these schools were looked at during phase 1 as well.
Yeah, is there any, I'm kind of on your boat where it's very hard to distinguish between the one and the two, and it feels like an obvious one or one of them, but which one? I don't know. Is there anything else that anybody could shed light on?
Well, this is the job of the committee, right? Is to parse through these things and rank these 7 schools. Remember my guiding questions at the beginning. Well, if you close, remember this, there's some interconnected parts.
I have a question about the administration decrease. So if we were to move one of these schools to the other, have you figured in that you would possibly need a vice principal there?
That's certainly a possibility. I think that's kind of a secondary analysis as we go forward, but we do have ratios for student to administrator ratios.
But that's an important piece to point out, that it could impact the savings itself.
I mean, I would love to see our schools at 80% capacity and vice principals at every school with 80% capacity, because then we wouldn't have this issue.
I guess one just question about, are we ranking them today, or is this the end of the thing?
So it's going to be a cliffhanger. We're going to give you all this information. At the end, I might share my recommendation, and then we're going to send you off to think. And at the start of the next meeting, we're going to get your list.
I would love Excel. Yeah, I mean, it's tough because the Pennycook and Stephen, it feels very clear that one of them. Can I just talk freely, or is this like?
It's your committee.
It feels really obvious that one of them, and I say this as someone who has a vested interest because my kid will be going to whichever one is left potentially. My kid will start TK next year, and so. But it also seems obvious they're so close. They're very near each other. Like what you were saying, they're very, very similar. The size, they could fit. So it feels incumbent that we put one of them high on the list. But then there are others that also seem, so like it would be, their qualities might be very similar, but we have to just like put them very far away from each other in order for that to be the one that gets closed. Do you know what I mean? Or maybe I'm not being clear.
Or you could, we've structured this so that the work product is this list, right? But the list doesn't just have to be a name. There can be like explanation or additional, like if the committee's goal is we're putting, like Pennycook or Stephen first on the list because we think it's really important that this consolidation happen. You don't necessarily have to separate them on the list for that purpose. I think you could say, like, there can be bullets or like explanations provided with your list, right, to help communicate to the board what you're getting at. One of the things that I did want to mention when you're asking about the difference between those two sites, so remember the slide with the bond expenditures, right? One of those sites has an ongoing bond expenditure occurring currently, right? So money's being spent now to improve that site. I want to say Stephen. So that's one factor, right? One difference to think about. And then for those that are more familiar with those sites, I know when we talked about this the last time around, there was lots of discussion just about the physical way that those sites are situated in their neighborhoods and their geography, right? So, and you're gonna have to correct me about which one is which because I'm not super familiar with. But what I recall the conversation being is one is kind of tucked into into a hill or into homes where access is kind of a bit more limited, and the other has more kind of main streets around it. And there was lots of discussion about, well, what makes parents feel safer, or what gives better access to the site, right, for parents that are doing like pickup and drop off. On the flip of that, what gives what configuration gives less access to outsiders, right, getting access to the campus. So all of those kind of, dropping the pin at the site and seeing where it's located and what it looks like was also a very big part of the conversation when we talked about these two schools in phase one. Well, we didn't have a recommended closure, I think, because there was kind of a deadlock. There was people that felt strongly about both sites for those reasons, for difference of those reasons that I just mentioned, right? Some felt strongly about one and some felt strongly about the other. So there was no, resolution that I can report back.
Closing any school is going to be difficult. just to be clear, this is never an easy thing for a governing board to do. They rather not. So, you know, in the end, we have a direction we need to go in and things we have to account for, but no one's going to be happy when it comes to closing schools. I mean, that's just a sad reality.
I had a question. Going to that slide that's enrollment and capacity, does, for Stephen and Penny Cook, if we did the consolidation, is there a capacity for special education, and would that impact, like, how many students could then go to that school? Let me know if that made sense.
So that's why we included those numbers. So between Pennycook and Stephen, there are 8 total rooms that are currently used for either a special day class or a preschool class. So the preschool classes are licensed by the state to be in those rooms, right? So if we were to move them, we would need to relicense those rooms elsewhere. But we try to regionally provide those programs to make sure that that families in those neighborhoods can be served, and the program at Stephen is highly utilized by that neighborhood. So for special education classes, again, there are 3 classrooms dedicated at Pennycook and 2 at Stephen. Part of the reason we reduced the max capacity ratio, when we came last year, we had it at 30-1. We reduced it to 28, just to make sure we were not overstating capacity, so that we can maintain these rooms. It could result in a class being moved. I can't say that no classes would be moved, but the point is for us to be able to maintain the programs that are currently being provided, because we can't move and have 7 programs at Highland, or they already have several programs that they're serving. So we would want to be able to maintain them. Does that help?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, we're at Finney.
So there are 2 options here. One, take the entire program and move it to one of the schools that is vacated. And so the programmatic opportunities don't change. If we were to break up the programs and house them around, potentially the Finney continuation program, those students, if they were at one of our high schools, for instance, they might have access to classes that maybe they can't access now, because we might be able to have a teacher be a .2 to come serve and offer a higher level class than maybe they would generally have access to. So there's, again, I say may, because that would have to be something we really investigate of how that could happen in the schedule. But so contingent on any other campus being closed, we could move that facility. There's really no fiscal benefit on either one, because it is a separate school. It does require an administrator, right? It doesn't, we can't just absorb it into all of the other programs. That would be too many programs. There's limited negative impact to moving all the programs together, but there could be some negative impact by distributing them, because we would need to make sure that those programs can be managed effectively. So for instance, independent study. Independent study is a complex program to manage, and it has a lot of legal requirements. We don't want it to be anyone's afterthought, right? It needs to be managed effectively. So that is something to consider. And then the facility options, possible sale or lease, or
Repurposed. Yeah.
repurposed, yeah.
I will say, though, with the facility option for Finney campus could generate a fiscal benefit, right? So a sale or lease of that property could generate revenue in the long term.
It's a larger facility too. It was a former middle school, correct? Yeah.
It is so close to Vallejo High School. what would you sell or lease? What industry? That's also my neighborhood where I live, so I would be concerned about what would be coming. You have, again, I go back to the fact that where do we see that we lose when the students are leaving the district? Is it from movement from elementary to middle school? And the middle school, what we're hearing is that they don't want all the kids at one middle school, just like you have two high schools. Why would you have one middle school? You'd have two middle schools and two high schools. I know when that happened, and I understand that. But that may be part of our problem as far as losing students. So I hope you would take a look at that.
Well, and one thing to note is, even if we were to move the current programs off Finney, a sale of a property doesn't happen overnight.
I understand.
Right, we would probably repurpose that property in the transitional phase, which could generate analysis. Maybe that does eventually become another middle school at some point down the line.
Exactly.
Yeah, but we would have that option available.
Exactly. And the fact that which site, Hogan or Vallejo Middle, which has the facility-wise, age-wise, and everything?
That I don't know specifically as far as which campus is older.
I'm not sure because I thought they tore it totally down and rebuilt it with the current facility, and Hogan is from its original facility. I don't know.
So it could be potentially, right?
I'm just saying that.
This doesn't close the door on that, just to be clear.
What would be some possible outcomes if it was surplus? You said this is the one that's like easier, right?
Well, part of the reason for the surplus designation is the options. So because there's limited bond dollars used on that facility, we're not running the risk of having to pay money back to the voters. It's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong. So you could potentially lease that campus to different types of services. For example, we're in the process of working on a lease with a non-public school agency. Now, NPS, you might have heard of that. Sometimes we have students who have some highly specialized needs that we can't serve in our programs, and we have to pay for them to go to a non-public school, which is essentially a private school. There currently are not any MPSs within the Vallejo boundaries, so most of the kids we end up sending to an MPS have to travel great distance. So we're in the process of negotiating a lease with the old Franklin campus, which has been closed now for many years, for some of the school facilities to open an NPS within our boundaries. Strategically, that's going to give us access to a school that we end up paying for anyways in our neighborhood, so we reduce cost of transportation in other areas. So there are options for things like that. The housing option is one that we've looked at. You know, there is interest from the governing board to see workforce housing is a big thing, you know, and if we can do something like that on one of our properties, that would be a tremendous, I would think, a win for the community.
This is not one of the stats, but I'm just curious for actual size, like square feet. Can we see those stats? We have like the population stats, but just like how much space is there? Like, is there, like for Stephan, for example, the Stephan and Pennycook, is there a big difference both between like a like a space inside the buildings.
Just the
and also,
footprint?
like the land.
We can provide that at a future meeting.
So which one are we on now?
Oh, right, there's more.
Highland
All
or
right.
Cooper?
So Highland and Cooper, similarly, they're not terribly far apart. Any things that we do for Highland and Cooper would mean redrawing the boundaries. For Cooper, it might include Solano Wiedemann. For Highland, if we're redrawing, we would probably include Lincoln. And again, similar programmatic, we would take the next steps to investigate what other kind of programming we can add to those schools. Again, all these programming options come with their own costs, right? If we're going to do them, we need to do them well, but also provide for greater collaboration across grade spans. Fiscal benefit is slightly different, a little more fiscal benefit at Highland, but there are more students there that would be impacted. Again, both of these campuses would require some transportation services. We would need to combine programs again to make sure that the SDC and preschool programs are served. They both have preschool and SDC, so they're both be impacted in that way. And that might be one of the considerations for one program versus another, and how we move things around. Again, they're both highly utilized for expanded learning, and we could move, again, the Finney Complex programs to one of those sites. Now, we couldn't move Finney Complex program to all sites.
We cannot.
So, so we would need to have some conversations about what other options and what are the other needs, not just to fill the space, but what are the needs in our district that we can accommodate.
Any questions on Cooper or Highland?
So I would say a majority of the slides that we talked through today were really about that first question, right? Trying to order 1 through 7. And this is just kind of a reminder about the second ask or task of the committee, is that these are the 4 sites on that list that haven't been designated as surplus already. So to the extent that the board decides to close one or multiple of these, would the board like to designate that site as surplus so that it could be used for something like a long-term lease or a sale of the property?
And one thing to know is by designating, that doesn't mean these schools are closing. It doesn't mean that we're selling these schools. It just gives the governing board the potential option to do some things.
Right, yep. If anything, it opens up more options for the board because it puts those long-term lease or sale options on the board where those things are not options if the site is not surplus. And it also doesn't mean that it can't be used for something in the short term and then returned to an instructional use, right, like later in time. It opens up short-term options that then could lead back to direct, school district uses if circumstances change in the future.
Just more curiosity than anything, for those that, could potentially either be available for long-term lease or for sale, what information is available as far as their condition with things like asbestos-containing material, lead-based paint, that sort of thing? If you're looking at a potential demolition or lease, sale. And along with that, I would be curious to know what kind of environmental studies have been done, like phase 1 or phase 2 environmental reviews.
Typically, we won't conduct those environmental reviews outside of testing water unless we're doing construction on the site. And you're thinking along the right terms with regard to the surplus sites that we do have. We do have a grant school that is still there that does have some environmental concerns. And so that goes into the process of how we decide what to do with those properties.
But right now, you don't have any current information along those lines that might help sway the decision for liability issues or others whether or not to consider sale or lease.
Nothing official, but I would say that a lot of the sites have similar construction, similar bones, if you will, as they were designed during the same era. So some of the challenge that we have seen when we have modernized those sites could be a challenge that we would foresee coming to us, right?
Mm-hmm. Great questions.
I was going to note too, so there are sites, for example, like Rollingwood, like one of the biggest sources of revenue for districts in sale is for residential development, right? And so developers will come, and we commonly don't do a phase 1 or a phase 2 because they're going to do a phase 1 and phase 2 with their own consultant during their diligence period. And I have rarely seen a transaction take a change or lead to additional costs for a district because of the factors that you mentioned. They know they're going to demo and grade that site a certain number of feet below current grade, and so it's going to really fix any top level like soil contamination. Like most of those things are not, even if they were to exist on a site, they wouldn't be a barrier for like a residential developer, for example. Now some short-term uses like a lease to an MPS or use of existing facilities could be more sensitive to things like that, and so that would be something for us to look into. But even on the sites, like we heard from Mr. Fernandez, even on the sites that are going through that process, the phase 1s that have been conducted resulted in very minor findings about the environmental condition of the sites, to the extent that there were very few uses that they even recommended would need to have a phase 2 review because of potential contamination. So while we don't have current, and it wouldn't really be prudent from a fiscal perspective to phase 1, phase 2 every site just to see what's there at this point, most of the sites that we have looked at in that regard don't have major environmental issues that would lead to that would stop or severely impact a deal of that nature.
It'd probably come down to more or less a financial consideration in the transaction is what it usually comes down to.
Right,
So-
right.
Any further questions on this specific ask, the surplus?
As you said, and as it seems it's been teed up, this is just for us to decide to authorize it. We declare a surplus means it can be used for these other purposes, but not necessarily that they will be used for any of these other purposes.
That's right.
So is there any real advantage, because it's like the board is going to go through and make any of these decisions anyway, any disadvantage of just declaring all of them surplus? Or how should we be thinking about that question to give the district flexibility?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, there really aren't a whole lot of disadvantages. I mean, once you give it that particular designation, it stays that way, right? So we had talked about how there are 2 prior 7-Eleven reports, 2020 and 2024, that already looked at a number of these other sites and have given them that particular designation because the goal of those committees was we want to give the board maximum flexibility to figure out what makes most sense. And if you foreclose the option for a long-term lease on a site, that really does restrict the board's ability to find a better option or an alternative. Some people will say like, well, if we know the site shouldn't be closed and it should always be used for an instructional purpose, then there's no way that it makes sense to declare it surplus. But in my mind, that's just not really the case for any of these sites, right? Like even if you want to house a special program there as opposed to a direct instructional program, there's a benefit to flexibility and declaration as surplus.
I think I just wanted to say, with these 4 being the ones that we're considering as surplus, I think then we're just taking into account the information that we've already received. Where like, for me, just from today's information and from the public comment, it wouldn't make sense to have Federal Terrace as a surplus because of the transportation impact that it would have on the students if we have to move them. Like, same thing as if we closed it, right? Or am I messing that up?
Well, I think what I would say is the board may choose to close Federal Terrace, right? Like the committee can't decide what the board would choose to do. But if they did choose to close Federal Terrace and it was empty, would it make sense for it to have a surplus designation so it could be reused for something else, like a long-term lease? So you're not deciding.
Yeah, Yeah.
whether to close these schools.
just doing the
You're just
ranking.
saying like, if the board were to decide that these sites should be closed, and you can imagine that they would sit, right? Would you want the board to have the option to do one of the things that can only happen if the site is declared as surplus?
So as we close out, I guess this is my opportunity to give you my recommendation of where I sit as the superintendent, right? I have to think big picture. I have to think about not only the short term, but the long term fiscal solvency of this district. So my team asked me recently, as we were preparing for this meeting, well, what should we be doing? Where should we be going? And so I mentioned 3 schools. I said, think about if we're closing 3 schools. So if you ask me today, this is today, and this could change with new information, new data, but as of today, I would close Lincoln. I would consolidate Pennycook into Stephen Manor. I would close Cooper. I would then repurpose one of those sites for Finney, moving Finney Complex over. Most likely of these options, probably to Cooper or Pennycook, one of those 2. And then I would reimagine what do we do at the schools that are receiving students. So Federal's receiving students or Stephen Manor's receiving students. How do we make those schools attractive to our community so we don't lose them to American Canyon or Benicia? Do we ensure they have programs our community wants? I've heard a lot since last year about an arts magnet or an performing arts program. Well, we should start that at the elementary schools. And we should put the energy into something like that that's attractive for our community. So that's today. That's superintendent as of July 7th, where my head is when it comes to school closures. It doesn't mean that's the direction that'll end up being, because ultimately the governing board will make that decision with recommendations from this committee, recommendations from the equity impact analysis, and additional information as we get into the fall. I'm definitely interested in your thoughts on these recommendations, but also everything you've learned today. And like I said, we will come back at the beginning of the next meeting to really hear from the committee what those rankings should be.
I was just going to pause for now, though, and say, if there's any discussion from the committee about kind of initial thoughts about the 2 asks, right, the surplus and that listing, we could certainly have, a short discussion now about just kind of what has come to mind after all of the data that you've seen so far today.
I just had a question because I heard earlier mentioned that the first phase was deadlocked. When we're coming up with the order, we have to, what is the ratio of like agreeance on that? Like, does the committee have to like unanimously agree on the order? Or is it like a majority vote or something? Like, how would we determine that?
Yeah, so the recommendation comes from the committee as a body, right? So you have to have a majority in agreement on the recommendation. Yeah, so once you start to, have names that will go in a certain order, we'll be taking, I think, a number of different votes at the next, several meetings to kind of start to solidify that list. Any other thoughts, comments, questions?
It doesn't seem that there's really any downside to the surplus designation for any of these. It just expands the options, correct?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
that's how I see it.
So what should we be thinking about for like next time? Should we be coming in with a little list of our own, or should we, or how's that process going to work?
Yeah, so let's jump forward in section 5, there are kind of 2 more main things that we wanted to do this evening. And the first is look at the form of the draft report that was provided with the materials. And this is just kind of a framework, right? A structure. The goal there was to just give you some idea of what the report could look like. And if you look at that kind of a framework, we start with a summary of all the dates that the committee met. We list out the committee members. There's a section that speaks to the requirements within the education code for, what the task or the responsibility of the committee is. We talk about the properties that have been designated. And then we speak to some of the data and information that was brought forward at the meetings. Some committees feel really strongly about making it clear, you know, this was what was brought to us and this was the scope of the information provided, and that's what resulted in our recommendation. And then we jump into the findings and recommendations. So I would say it's really up to the committee about how you want to structure this, but I gave, you know, kind of an initial thought of the chart that lists the sites and then declares them as surplus or not surplus, and then, you know, has the listing of the 1 through 7, and certainly, as I mentioned earlier, that listing could come with, you know, like notations or clarifications to help explain why the listing is provided the way that it has been by the committee. So to answer your question, what should you be doing between now and the next meeting? I think really thinking about those 2 questions that have been posed to you, right? The first is, of the 4 sites that we're asking, should they be surplus? What are your thoughts on that question? And then, yeah, I mean, you could start to jot down your own personal list of you know, 1 through 7, or, you know, I guess major things that you feel are important with regard to certain consolidations. Like if there are 2 or 3 sites that you think should be near the top of the list, maybe you just bring that with the rationale, and then combined, you all kind of move those things into a 1 through 7. So it's really up to you about, you know, how you want to go about deliberating and kind of inputting your own personal information. But the idea is that, and this is kind of the explanation for how the committee will proceed with our 3rd meeting. So we have 2 more meetings left, right? The next one has the public hearing, which is an obligation within the statute. So what we think that will look like is that we have all of this data. There have been some questions and probably more data that we can bring to you at the next meeting to help answer some of those questions. And then the first half of the meeting will really just be, you know, the committee deliberating and you all kind of talking through your thoughts about questions, you know, 1 and 2, and then, you know, coming to a draft report or a draft set of recommendations on those 2 points. And then we open the public hearing to receive comments, in addition to the public comments that we receive at each meeting on the content of that draft report and the, you know, the workings of the committee so far. And then we can make additional updates to the content of that draft report after the public hearing. And then your final meeting will be the 4th meeting at the beginning of August. And that's really when you solidify and we take, you know, like final votes on those 2 recommendations, and then the committee draft, or the committee report in its final form will be signed at that point. So before we adjourn for the evening, any additional substantive thoughts or any, you know, commentary or deliberation that you want to have now before next meeting, knowing that we will have a public hearing at the next meeting? Yeah.
I am curious, like for the committee, what, if anybody sort of has thoughts or, you know, what direction you're thinking in. To me, I'll go first, is the surplus one seems easy. Like I feel like, yes, give them flexibility. The Pennycook Stephan thing seems easy. Probably Pennycook to Stephan, but they're just so close. Finney also seems kind of easy. Like, I mean, they can fit in elsewhere. My big, and Cooper also seems kind of, I mean, it just keeps shrinking. But then Federal Terrace is the big question mark for me because it is so far away from all the other ones, and it does serve it. But then she said, like, the population has been like, I don't know, it's like all young professionals now. They don't have kids. Like, so maybe like demographically is not likely to come back and be a thriving other school. And you didn't put that on your list though. And so maybe there are some good ideas for what to do with it that aren't that. I don't know. So that seems to be the biggest question.
Yeah, I was thinking right now where I stand, like what I've noted, based on, what was that? The enrollment and capacity one. That slide kind of is what I was using. I had Pennycook going to Stephan, and then closing Lincoln just because of the capacity and the projected enrollment is the lowest, I think. And then I'm kind of like everything else, I'm really looking at the other data too. So but those are the ones that I was more like feeling more confident to present or talk about.
I kind of agree with what the superintendent said. I think that Federal Terrace is probably, would be harder for that one to close than any of the others. It would be more of a hardship for those students than any of the others. That's my feeling right there. And I'm not sure about, to me, it would be between Cooper and Highland, which one to close. But Lincoln, I think, definitely should be closed. And Finney, it would be easy. It would be an easy to just take that whole program to one of the other sites, just to, which site to determine. I think we're probably all on the same page. Do you want to say anything?
And then I think the only reason I mentioned Lincoln, I wanted to say, was because I think Assistant Superintendent Tapasio had said something about, because it is the lowest income community, not wanting to leave it. So like the only thing that I could see as closing it is if we were very, very intentional, like the board made a decision very intentionally on what to do there. Otherwise, that is like that was something that was mentioned a few times. It's the lowest income community. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think that is a tough one. I was gave a lot of thought to that. It's going to be hard for a lot of families, no matter what. Except for maybe the Stephen Petticoat. But yeah, it's gonna be hard for a lot of families. I think it's gonna be hard no matter what. It's gonna be hard no matter what.
Just know that you don't have to make the decision. You know, it's tough even not making that decision, right? To even rank these schools in a way. We know we're asking a lot from the committee. You know, you're gonna feel that internal tug. You're probably gonna go home tonight. You're gonna sleep on it. You're gonna come back to the charts and look at the data. And new questions will form over the next couple weeks as we prepare for the next meeting. So don't hesitate to reach out to us if something sparks and you have an idea or a thought or a piece of data you think you might need that'll help you make your list. So we want to be able to provide that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say again, Excel. If you have just like stuff that you all use with enrollment figures and, you know, anything that I can just look at and organize and do a pivot table or something like that would be nice.
I do have another question. Is how are you factoring in when the sites are vacant, the thefts that occur? Because I know that in the past we've had the copper wiring stolen of the vacant sites. There have been squatters at various sites. So how are we taking that into consideration when we talk about the cost savings? Because that adds additional funds.
When that's sort of built into some of those site safety things. And just to remind folks, we had copper theft on 2 sites this year that were in use, were active schools. So the copper theft is happening regardless of our properties. They're easier targets when there's no one at a property, but it hasn't stopped folks from hitting our schools.
That's part of the reason why we want to also make sure that we're using them for some, true purpose, so that they are active sites, not just sitting shuttered, right? And there's need in our community for things. We don't want to make up new things, but also utilize the space in part so that it doesn't fall into disrepair.
Because you talked about one of the issues is that enrollment's declining because people are going to American Canyon, charter schools, Benicia. I imagine their demographic trends are also like fewer young people, right? They part of that is not just a push out, but like a draw in, I would imagine, because their enrollments are probably going down as well, or like natural.
So both Napa Valley Unified, which includes American Canyon, and Benicia are also declining enrollment school districts, which is why they have no problem taking our students. They say yes, for the most part, to our kids when they want to go there. Benicia, their average daily attendance is made up of over 15% Vallejo resident students. So if we just pulled back 10%, one, it's going to impact Benicia because all of a sudden their budget's going to drop because our kids are paying for those schools.
Also, just kind of on the statewide level, as far as trends, like I was saying before, right, having worked with districts from the top of the state to the bottom, declining enrollment is, for the most part, a statewide issue. There are some places in the state, mostly towards Arizona, as you move east, that are expanding, aren't necessarily experiencing declining enrollment, but for the most part of those underlying like demographic trends, when I talk to the demographers statewide, is just people are having less children. I mean, that's just kind of a natural thing that's happening. Whereas maybe you needed 5 elementary schools in the 60s, you only need 2 or 3 now because people are just making different choices, right? Or waiting longer to have children.
We also need to acknowledge that what is happening in our country right now with immigration is also going to impact our schools. Because we do have students who come to this country who we educate. And those shifts are going to have an impact in Vallejo, in Oakland, in certain communities at a greater rate.
There was also a big drop after the pandemic, right? There was a kind of a gap of kids that just never really came back to school, right? For various reasons. They moved out of the country, they moved to private or charter, they moved out of state. There's this kind of, again, for the most part, kind of a statewide trend of loss or decline in enrollment. So while some of these things are Vallejo, specific, the underlying trends that we're seeing we're seeing everywhere.
Are we going to be able to see, I think T-Lac mentioned this earlier, about some of that additional data for some of these schools that are maybe secondary languages or something, like services that are at programs at those schools that aren't necessarily like special education, but would impact, like if they had to move to another school, you'd have to hire additional instructors or things like that, or aides or something.
I mean, I think, so the purpose of a request for that data is to identify additional costs associated with new hire if those kids were moved. Yeah, I think, I mean, there may be some more that we could bring forward, but I think most of that's being looked at in the context of the EIA, right? I mean, you heard in almost each of the 9 factors that I described, there's so much emphasis on race and, like disability and, like homelessness. All of those factors are going to be so intricately looked at in the scope of the EIA. I wouldn't want to overwhelm you with that information for the purposes of what this committee is doing, because I think given that we have, essentially two meetings left to make a decision, I almost think it's less helpful to provide that level of detail.
Just on the, just to be thinking about special education holistically, every single one of our campuses, our elementary campuses, with the exception of Lincoln and Cave, house special day programs, and there's none that in an equity impact report, there's not going to be any that says, oh, this campus isn't impacted by special education needs. All of our campuses are. So there won't be one that you could choose over another on that basis, especially not of the ones we have here. Just giving you that context.
I think also too, there are so few programs that can't be moved, right? Like especially in a special education context, it's not like if the school closed, the program would cease to exist. It would just go to a different location. That piece of the EIA that I was talking about is sometimes there are, and it's not in the special education context, but highly specialized other types of programs that couldn't move, but that's relatively rare, right? So it's not like you would lose it just by closing a site; it would just go somewhere else. Any final thoughts, questions? Okay, hearing none. So our third meeting is July 28th, and I think we're going to try to reach out to the committee members a little bit in advance just to make sure that you all, or at least 6, can be here so we have a quorum so we can proceed. And the next meeting, we'll have the public hearing. Fourth meeting is August the 11th, and then the final presentation of the committee report will be August the 20th at the board meeting. And then I will pass it to our committee chairwoman to do the adjournment.
Alrighty, can I get a motion to close us out officially?
So moved.
Thank you. That was Sandra, right? Okay. So can I get a second? Thank you, Christine. Perfect. Okay, and then, I have to do the voter to
Please.
close this out. All right, Hazel. Can I get you to vote?
Aye.
Kimberly, aye. Tilak,
Aye.
Christy,
Aye.
Sandra,
Aye.
Ivana.
Aye.
We are officially closed at 7:19 p.m.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.